try to help whoever needs help. So I've kicked it off, my app op with my lesson 12 with NodeMon. And then I think before we make changes, so we've kind of got the read operation done. This is where we left off last week. It's a very confused look on your face, or you weren't here last week. So let's have a look at what we did. So we got rid of the Express Views folder. We're no longer using EJS as our templating. So in our app.js, we added a new controller called API. And then we set our app engine, we changed the path to client app views. So that was where our pages are found. And we're calling render file, so now we could load HTML views instead. So our views are just HTML and Angular. We're not using EJS. So we set that up. We also just took out the error handling in app.js. So if things crashed, rather than loading our error view, we'd actually see an error message in the browser. And we mapped the URL/API. When we go to our API, we actually get all our data in JSON format. And some of you installed to Chrome or Firefox a JSON viewer so that your JSON looks like this, nicely formatted. So we made those changes in app.js. We created an API.js. So this right now only has one method. It's got a get method at the URL/API. We find the books, but previously we were rendering a view and passing that data to the view. This time all we do is send back the JSON. And then inside of our client, this is where our Angular application lives. So we had components, services, and views. And we, inside of our app component, we made a book component that had a get method. Our get method called our service. And our service made a get request to our API and sends back the JSON. So this is kind of where we left it off. And then inside of our views, we had index.html, which is like our template with our header and footer. And then our Angular application lives in here, inside of this book component. So this is rendered with our books.html. That looks much like our old EJS view, except we're doing this as a single page application. So we actually have a form at the top and our table down at the bottom. So morning. This is where we kind of left off last week. I'm going to do just a couple of other things in terms of the architecture. I'm going to close up my client folder for a minute. We don't have to do this, but I think if we're going to use Angular, this is maybe a bit cleaner. In my lesson 12, I'm going to make a new directory. Again, completely optional. I'm going to call it server. We're going to put all our Node and Express files in the server directory. WebStorm will rewrite the path. So that way we've got server with our Node and Express and client with our HTML and Angular. I think I like that solution a little better. Public folder, we don't need this anymore. We can delete that because Angular really, it's kind of, everything in the client is now here. So actually, but it does have, let's see, it's got our CSS. Well, it doesn't have, we don't have JavaScript. Maybe what I'll do here, rather than delete this folder, I'm going to move it from the root inside of our client folder because these are public assets. public client-side JavaScript images style sheets. So I'm going to move this of, well, let's see. Let's move it inside of client and app. And I'll let WebStorm change any paths. Sorry? Because it's running. Thank you. So nice to have smart people fix my mistakes. It's not, but you know what? We used for the, in our index.html, we used the CDN. I would prefer to use a local copy of Bootstrap because when we use the CDN, A, it's slower, and B, we don't get the code hinting. When we type class equals, we don't get the code definitions when we're linking to a remote style sheet. So I would rather download that stuff so that we have it locally. So I'm going to move my public folder inside of client and app. Now, my models and my routes, I'm going to move those inside of server because that's our Node and Express backend with our controllers and our views. So I'm going to move models into server. I'm going to move routes into server. The other thing I probably should have done way back in week 4 when we started with the Express generator is I really hate calling this folder routes. These are controllers. I don't know why the generator likes to call them routes. To me, routes means URL paths is how I think of it. So I'm going to rename this. And next time I teach the course, every time I use the Express generator, I'm going to immediately change routes to controllers because it makes more sense. Again, all of this architecture, this is optional. You don't have to change anything. If you're happy with your architecture, leave it alone. To rename, if I click on routes and choose refactor, I get rename. So I'm going to change this to controllers. So I think this is a better structure. So now if we look at our route in our client app, we have the Angular components, Angular services, HTML views, and we have our public assets with images, JavaScripts, and style sheets. In server, we simply have models and controllers. Pretender, is this any better? Okay. And WebStorm should have rewritten all my paths. So for example, to our controllers, writes those links. So everything should still work. So if I launch the app again, it should all still run. Except our path now to our book model is crashing. So let's go and find where we're connected to our book model. Just close everything up. So that should be inside of controllers and API. This may have to become a double slash. Right, sorry. I think that will be the path now. Nope. Yeah. So we change that path to .. / models. And our app should hopefully run as it did before. Our API works. And our Angular, we haven't really changed anything on the Angular front end. We've just kind of restructured our back end a little bit. I'm also just going to copy. I want to replace the Bootstrap CDN link with a local instance of Bootstrap. So the easiest way to do that, and also we don't have jQuery in here. So if we go into our public JavaScripts, there's nothing here. So I'm just going to go back to like my lesson 8 or lesson 9 because we have all that stuff there. If I look in public, we also have our little delete confirmation and jQuery. We're going to want those things. And our style sheets, we've got Bootstrap. So what I'm going to do, and we also have a font. So go to your lesson 8 or lesson 9, just copy the public folder and paste it into client app in lesson 12. So that way we'll get all those files. So I'll go into client and app, and I'll overwrite my public, which is basically blank. It's just got those 3 empty folders. And I'll just say, yeah, go ahead and merge that stuff. So now we've got all the JavaScript we've written previously. We've got our style sheets. So now if we go into views and index, I can change my style sheet link here. To we may have to play with the path a little bit to get it right. So now public style sheets. Okay, it's not liking that. It's there. // That may or may not work at runtime. We may have to modify the path a little bit. We'll see. Okay. Clearly not the path we wanted. So when I right. If we start in the root, we'll figure it out. Now we're also going to want jQuery and our client script, because our client script contains the delete confirmation we wrote. On our delete button, when we click it, we want to invoke this script. So if someone clicks delete, rather than doing a delete automatically, it pops up our little, are you sure you want to delete this message? So down at the bottom, let's add our couple of JavaScripts. So we'll add our link to jQuery, which we need, and we'll add the link to our client scripts because it contains that little delete confirmation method we wrote. So we'll add the links to these 2 files. And then on our delete button, if we give our delete buttons a class of confirmation, that jQuery script gets attached. And this would be on our books HTML view. So we've got a delete button with a Bootstrap class for styling, but if we add confirmation here, it attaches our JavaScript to it. So we haven't done anything new. We're just adding back stuff we already did in our EJS version. So if we click one of the buttons now, we should get a confirmation. Maybe not. That's interesting. I'll have to figure that out. Okay, that's fine.
I have a modal that I used in mine, but I just put it directly into index.js. I have the line on click, will return, confirm, and then are you sure you want to delete? And it pops up the modal and it gives a yes or no. So after class button change or confirm, right in index.js, I have it.
So you just put in the JavaScript, right?
Right there. After confirmation, I give it a comma, and then I wrote on click equals return.
Right.
And then are you sure you want to delete?
Yep. Okay, that should work. You know what? There's some different ways. I have to think about how we want to do this. That is an option to write an on-click handler here. That would work. Another option is we could leave this out and we could handle it in the component. So when it calls the delete method in the component, our component renders the confirmation message. Let's see. So return. Okay, yeah, I think that should work. So this is how you did it, Tiffany? Try that and see if what that does. Okay. All right. I'm not sure why it's not calling my method, but that's okay. We can live with that. I'll mull that over, but that's good workaround. Okay, so what we want to do, our first step is we want to get our form working. So when we fill out the form and add, we need to write a post handler in our API that will accept in a form post, and we'll use our book model to create a new instance of a book. We then immediately want to call our get method so that our list repopulates, and then we want to clear out our form. Okay. So let's open up our API. And now we're back in our Node Express world. We're going to write the server end of this first. We're going to use post method. Notice it's the same URL path. The URL path doesn't really change here. We'll write our regular callback. We'll instantiate a new instance of a book, and we'll fill it with our request body. We don't have to map the individual properties. Mongoose is smart enough to do the mapping for us, because our values from our form post will match the properties of our book model. So it knows we don't have to match them up. Then we'll just call save. And we'll get back either an error or a book object. If we get an error, we will log it. And then we'll send back the error response. We'll attach on a header code of 501. If something goes wrong, we can't save the new book properly. Otherwise, we'll send a JSON response with our new book. And we'll send the HTTP status code 201. Anybody seen 201 before? Have any idea what it means? We know 200 is okay. So what would 201 be? Google's your friend. What does HTTP status 201 mean?
It says 201 is created. The request has been fulfilled and has resulted in one or more new resources being created.
Yeah, so 200 is just a generic okay. So 201, anything in the 200 means it was a success, but we get a description. So 201, as Tiffany said, it indicates new data was created, which is good. So if we're going to do a post and save, let's return a 201 status to the browser. So there's our controller method. That's it. Just like with our get, we're not rendering a view. We just interact with the model, talk to MongoDB, save the data, and send a JSON response back to whatever application is calling it. Could be our own Angular app, could be a mobile app, could be somebody interfacing with our API. Heck, we can even test it with an HTTP tool like Fiddler. We could just send a post request with those values and see what we get back. So that's the first of our 3 methods we need to write. So our server controller method is done. So now we need a method in our Angular service. We've got our book service. We're going to open that up. So we've got a get method that calls our API. Now we need a post. So first, create new book instance. Here's something we didn't do last week. We defined our book service. We had a constructor, but we didn't actually define any properties of a book. For doing a get, we don't need any individual properties because we just are subscribing to and sending back a JSON response. Oh. Sorry. Sorry, actually, no, that I'm confusing myself. That's in our component. We define the properties. My apologies. Okay. Sorry, we don't need a new book instance. Our service is already going to pass us one. So we just accept our add method in the service just accepts a book object. That will come from our component. Before we can call the post method in our API, because we're taking data in, we need to set up the application headers so that we know we're getting in JSON. So here's where we're using the headers library we imported last week. It's part of the Angular HTTP. We're importing the headers class. So we're instantiating a new instance of HTTP headers. And we're calling the append method of this class. So what we want to append on is the content type as application JSON. Now we can call the post method of our API. We use the HTTP library again. We can see the common methods. We used get last week. This time we're going to use post. At the same URL, so we don't need another URL. Just make a post to our API. We call the JSON stringify method, basically converting our JSON object. Our new book comes in as JSON. We actually need to convert that to a string to do the post. So we call stringify with our new book. We pass the headers in. And like we did with get, we then called .map to receive the response, that basically to subscribe to the response that comes out of our post method, which will either be an error or a JSON response. So there's our Angular call to our Express API post method. So our next step is going to be to write the add method in our Angular component that instantiates an instance of that book class and passes it, invokes the add method in the service and passes in a book object. So we've now written 2 of our 3 add methods. One in our API Express on the server using our Mongoose model, and now our Angular service that calls our Express method. So now we're going to need to access our book component. So we've already got a get books that can be called from our, well, it's called basically as soon as we instantiate an instance of our component. So we want our add method to do a few things. What should happen inside of the add method here? What things do we need to do? Okay, so we need to take the book data from the form. Yep. Once we have the book data from the form, what do we do with it? Okay, where do we pass it? Do we pass it to the API? Right, so we're going to make a post request, call it the add method of our service. So it's not a post request yet, and then the service calls a post method in our express controller. So we've defined here a book component. Right now we have a books and a title, and we're just displaying this title in our. I'm going to change this. I'm going to hard code the title because our books have a title property. So we can't have two variables called title. And we want title to refer to the book property. So I'm just going to hard code this in here. What did we call it? I'm just going to hard code in our H1 tag. So that way in my book component, my title is actually a string. What other properties do we need in our book component? Basically going to match what's in our book model. Yep, so we need an author. Yep. I've got a year. And one more important field we need. Yes, it should be. Yeah, the actual class, thank you, are all lowercase. What's one other field we need if we're going to be doing editing, deleting? Yeah, we need the ID. We're not going to be able to identify any book if we don't have the ID. So underscore ID. And we have the price as well. Okay, hang on. Let's look at our book model for a second. Now, what type should the ID be? You can see the values in the status bar. It is a Mongoose object ID. For our purposes, we probably need to declare it as, I mean, a number isn't going to work because there are string characters there. We'll try it as a string. Otherwise, we'll need to import Mongoose because it won't know, Angular has no awareness of Mongoose's native data types. So we'll try it as a string for now. That would be the other option is, yeah, we could define it as any.
Will it be an object of the type? ID is an object in Mongoose.
But if it's a client side, so we cannot put object here.
We can write void objects.
We could, yes, but it would need awareness of that type of object, right? We'd have to know what that object is. And I think we had price as well. Now we can write our add method. Now we'll just fill the properties, as Prav said, from our form. So our form's got title, year, and author. We left price out. We'll just skip price. I don't think it's required, or it will default to 0. So we have title. So we've created the new book. And now we're going to refer to our book service and call the add book method we just wrote and pass in our new book object. And again, we'll subscribe to the response. We could actually log this out. And then we want to take this new book and add it to the existing array of books. So because this section is always bound to the array books, as soon as we add our new book here, the new book should appear in our table without a refresh, because Angular always keeps that table that we've created bound to this array. So if we change something in this array, it should automatically change the HTML.
The service returns the books in form of JSON, and we add it to a book of type and array. Will it work like that?
Well, the book itself in the service isn't typed.
But it returns a JSON object,
It returns JSON, yes.
and we add the JSON object to array.
Well, we're not actually adding what is coming back. We're adding the object we're creating from the form. So we don't really need to do anything with that response, really. We're just logging it. We're not adding the response to the array. We're adding this one. Let's try. I mean, another option, another thing we could do, probably less efficient from a performance, is instead of pushing it, we could also then potentially call the get method after, except that involves another trip to the database.
Where do we use the ID? We declare the ID property too.
We don't need the ID yet. We'll need it, basically we didn't need it yet. We'll need it when we do edit and delete.
When we get books was returning to JSON, for the books also we were just entering the JSON only. Because in book service, for get books we are returning the JSON API. We are just adding one more is set book.
Okay, yeah. Well, let's see what happens. Now there's one more thing. If we fill out the form right now, there's still nothing will happen. None of this code will get executed. So we have one more step. We've written 3 versions of the add method, but we have one more thing to do. Yeah, so in our form, right, we've set up our inputs, but they're not connected to this in any way. So we need to add something into these inputs as well as our add button. So right now you could fill out your form all you want, nothing's going to happen. So we need to add some Angular directives to our 3 inputs as well as to our button. So what should go here? How do we tie one of these inputs to a property of our component? what we need is ng model. Bigger syntaxes. Round brackets, square bracket, equals title. So this binds that input box to the property of the book component. So here our ng model is year. Here it's author. Hang on, let me just double check my brackets. There's definitely a round and a square. I want to make sure I get them in the right order. Square, then round. Sorry. Square. So lastly, on our add button, we want to set up then when it's clicked, what function do we call? Yeah, so we'll call book function when the button's clicked. That calls our add book function here. So now we should be able to try it out. Okay. So if we put in book, put in any values you like, see what happens. So our form called our component called the service called the API talked to our model, and notice our page never refreshed. Everything's still here. So it basically worked. There's one last step we didn't do. What's missing from here? Yeah, we should clear the form. So maybe what we want to do is write a reset method, because we'll want to do the same thing after we edit. So rather than writing the code into our add form to clear them out, let's call a reset function, create a reset function that we can call when we edit or we add, and it'll wipe out any of the values in the form. So let's go back to our component. So we can call this method reset, or we could call it clear form. So what should we do to clear the form? Rather than clearing the form directly, we actually want to clear out the angular values that are bound to the form. Yeah, so we can null out those values, and that should automatically clear the form. So after we're done, here, we want to then call our clear form. Oops, I guess this should be this dot clear form. So if we add a new book now, our form should immediately clear out and that book should get added to the bottom. Our page never reloads, so our form always is bound to those angular values. As soon as those angular values change, our form changes both here and here. So we've got the two-way data binding in action now. So our form doesn't need to reload to show us the current data. So again, here's our two new methods that we've added in our component.
Can you split up like inputting and the input form? Somebody find the data to our like the Angular models and then call add books.
You mean you want to do this, or could potentially somebody do this?
Yes, because the validation is in like form required at minimum.
Good question. Well, we also have validation in our model, keep in mind.
It only runs on the add when we update it, never runs the validation.
It should.
You can input the negative price on update.
The Mongoose models should, the validation rules should.
I think required runs, but minimum is not running on update.
We'll try it when we come to update. It's supposed to. So here was our service. So we accept our book object, our JSON object from our component. Headers is JSON, and then we pass that. We make a post request to our API. So our backend's becoming much more lightweight. It's just JSON in, talk to Mongoose, JSON out. That's all it does. Doesn't care about the rest of the application or what's calling it. So the next thing we want to do is make it so when we click on one of these, rather than go off to a different page, we want to run a GET request, but with an ID, and we want to populate our form. We also want to hide this button and show an update button in its place. So when we click the update button, that way we can have two buttons.
You can just change the button and the function.
Well, there's different ways of doing it. Yes, you could change the function. Personally, I prefer to have two buttons because each button then runs its own function. So let's create another button right beside here. I'll just copy my add button, just paste it, and this says update. And our click method is going to call update book. Now, we never want both of these buttons to show at the same time. So how can we determine? We can use some logic with Angular to show one button and hide the other one. Any thoughts about how we might do that?
We can see if there's an ID set.
Okay, so what might be an easy thing to do is let's add on a hidden field and bind it to the ID. So when the ID is not showing, we want to see the add button. When the ID has a value, we want to hide the add button and show the edit button.
There will be some ID.
Pardon?
On the lead, there will be some ID.
Not being populated into the form. We don't, rather than checking whether the component has an ID, let's put a,
But if we do the edit button is clicked, no issue with
it shouldn't, we shouldn't see it. We'll try it and see. So maybe down below here, I'll just put on a hidden, well, I'll put on an input. I won't make it hidden yet. Score ID. And we'll give it an ng model of underscore ID. We'll add type equals hidden in a bit, but for now we want to show it, we want to make sure it works. So on our add button, we can add star ng if. So let me think about this. Hold on for a minute. Let's do it on our update button first. Star ng if equals ID. So if we have an ID value, that button should be visible.
should we make the ID only?
Well, we're going to make it hidden. For the moment, I want to be able to type it and delete it and see what happens with the button. Eventually, that field will be hidden entirely. Let's just try this for a second. So right now, there's no ID, so our update button doesn't show. Soon as we put a value in that box, which is bound to ID, update button shows up, which is what we want. We want it when the user clicks edit, it should fill the whole form, including this, although this field will be hidden. That will make turn our update button visible. We have to do the opposite with our add button, but we can't use the same kind of ng if. Yeah, what do we want to do? Let me do it this way. With our add button, we do star ng if equals underscore ID. So when underscore ID has no value, add button is visible. So these two buttons should never be visible, can never be visible at the same time, because the condition is the exact opposite. One of them shows when there's an ID, the other one shows when there's no ID. As soon as I get rid of that last character, update goes away and add shows up. And Angular helps us by that two-way data binding. We're giving the user a better experience. We can change things on the page at runtime based on data conditions. So now when we click on edit, we should add a click method here. We're not doing an update yet. We're selecting that book so we can display it in the form. So we might just call this one select book. And here we'll want to pass in the book ID. And this is inside of a loop. So remember, we have access to that book ID. In fact, we no longer need these as links. These aren't links. We're actually going to call, on the click, we're going to call a select or a delete method. So I'm actually going to take out and Tiffany, it just occurred to me why this didn't work. Because this class was to be attached to an A tag, and I attached it to a button tag. So I'll take out that. Get an A?
Yeah.
So now when I click on one of these, it's going to look for, it's not a link anymore, it's looking for an Angular method called select book. Doesn't do anything right now. It throws a JavaScript error because there is no select method in our component. So when we click select, click edit, it calls select book and passes in the ID. So now in our component, we're going to write our select method. Then we'll call our service. We'll also have a select method. Again, we pass in the ID. And we'll subscribe to the response. Oops, sorry. Our response so now we'll populate properties. Now I've got the red line because our service has no select method yet. That's our next step. Write the select method in our service. And then we need to write another get method in our Express controller that rather than getting all the books, just gets one. So in our service, we also want to select book method that takes an ID as a parameter and calls our API. Let's go to our book service and write. What type of HTTP method will we write here? We want to send to our API. Yeah, it's a GET. Why is it a GET? Yeah, we're retrieving data. So it's slash, and then we're going to append on the ID as a parameter. And again, just map the response to JSON. So almost the same as our get books method. Whoops, and sorry, that should be API slash. We're calling the same URL, but this time we have an ID parameter on the end of it. So now our Express controller, this is the last thing we have to do, and then we should be able to take a break. So now we need another get method in our Express controller when we have a get request at the root, but with an ID on the end. And then we're going to look up just that one object and send it back.
What is this an error from it? That is supposed to. How we catch errors?
I think we can use promise.
If we using the promise,
Yeah, we are using a promise.
No, it's exactly to very observable case. No,
Sorry, say that again?
as I know that method return observable, yeah, interface. So
this map method.
if we want to
returns an
catch,
observable.
we need to change promise and then catch.
But should it be done in the
In
server?
the heroes example, yeah, they show two examples. One is observable, one is the promise, and this is observable.
Yeah, good question. Let's have a look there. Let's see what they do here. I don't know if there's any error handling in here.
You didn't do it.
I have to give that some thought about the best way to do it.
Actually, in my previous project,
Mm-hmm.
at the time I didn't use this way. I use promise. I changed the after calling the get method. We call the to promise, and then I call then and catch together.
Okay.
Yeah, so I use this way. So, but I don't know this way how to call the catch. Right.
It's a good. I don't have a good answer for you right now, so I'm not going to make one up. I have to think about that. It's a fair question. With the observables, what the best way to do it is.
But if we don't return it directly, but store it directly.
Sorry, you have to speak up, please.
But if we don't return it directly, so get it, then check if it's a valid, then return or if it's return something else.
Yeah, that might be a way of doing it. We're also sending from here, we are sending status codes. So one possibility is to check the HTTP status that comes along with it. Mm-hmm. Okay. I'm going to think about it a little bit more.
One more thing. In the book service,
Yep.
we're using the headers. We actually instantiate a new object of headers, the new headers. But in the book component, we actually use the providers. Why don't we like make a new book service object in the company? We're using the book service. Why do we use providers or add it to the providers?
Well, it's only used in certain, it's only used in some of the methods. We're not using it in all the methods of the service. We only basically need it where we're doing a post or put. You're saying, so why aren't we adding it?
Why we don't create an object?
It's, so if we created an object here, we still need it in the service though. So how are you going to pass that to the service if we use it there? Yeah. We need it in order to post it to the API. We need the headers.
Yeah, you need the headers. Like, if you can create an object of book service inside the class itself in the book component, you won't really need to add into the providers.
I see what you're saying.
What is the purpose of providers?
Providers.
Now let's look at the definition.
How can I say? It is different. Actually, here, it means they will provide this one. So they will create the instance at this moment. And then this one is just inject. We will use. So it is not creation. This question is just we will get the instance. This different meaning. So we can put the provider. If we put the service in the app, we can use the service or service.
Here's their explanation here.
Yeah.
That in order to create, it's required in order to know how to make it. So it's required for their sort of dependency injection model. If you don't define it, it doesn't know how to create it, that instance. I agree. It doesn't seem, it shouldn't seem necessary. I see what you mean. So long as there's a reference to it, which there is, we should just be able to create it. But Angular doesn't, its dependency injection doesn't allow for that. If we took out the provider here, I don't think it's going to work.
Surely we can add this book service in mmodule.ts file. But it's only different is just scope. If we put the service in the app, we can use that service every place. But if we put that place, we can use that specific place.
Right. Well, it probably makes sense not to put it in app module because that service is only used by the book component. We don't really want to create, unless we find some other components where we're going to use it, there's probably makes sense to only instantiate it from there. Okay, I wanted to write our post method, but it's 12:25, so let's take a 20-minute break here. Okay, and we'll work in our API. I will push what I've done to GitHub so far, and we'll take a break here.